A question I get asked about quite regularly is, how do you build on uneven land? It's probably one of the steepest, no pun intended, learning curves in Conan, alongside building roofs, and it's not something I've really covered before. Therefore today I'll be doing my best to teach you how to build across uneven land. If you find this video helpful, don't forget to leave a like, and with that, let's begin. When it comes to uneven ground, there are a multitude of challenges that you have to face. The main one is of course the elevation difference, which is primarily what we'll be tackling. How exactly do you create a build on uneven ground that doesn't look completely ugly? Well, getting the best start on the build is important, and I believe the best way to do that is with pillars and ceilings. I've already got a full video detailing why I think this is the best way to start almost any build, but we're using it here mainly for the improved flexibility. Fence foundations can also work fairly well too, if you would prefer. There are three ways to tackle building on uneven ground. The first is the elevation method, which is very simple, so I'll show you that first. The whole idea of the elevation method is that you build the entirety of your base elevated above the uneven ground, and then merge the connecting parts of the build into the ground in an aesthetically pleasing way. The main benefit of this method is that it's considerably lower effort than any other, and keeps everything flat and simple on the interior. However, once we've built our base plate, it can end up pretty high. How do you make this look good? Well, there are a couple of ways, but the easiest is to simply cover the gaps first, and then create exterior facade elements to merge with the ground. This can be fancy sloping designs like I'm doing here, or just buttresses. Anything that isn't a flat surface running straight into the ground should work a lot better. It's also worth noting an extra benefit of this method. If the ground is particularly uneven, you might be able to squeeze some extra space into your build. It might only be a few tiles below the main floor, but that's a few tiles you can utilise for storage, an extra workbench or something else entirely. From there you can then build your base as you wish. That usual awkward transition down into the ground, which mostly gives builds like this a very ugly look to them, is now gone with the facade trick, and your base now merges into the ground below in a much nicer fashion. The best way to think of this is sort of widening your base out to make it seem like it's more supported by the ground. I find that's always a pretty effective way to tackle this. The elevation method is easy, and I suspect it was most people's first solution to building on uneven terrain. It can work with only some minor adjustments, it can work with most build sizes, and if you're just going for something simple, it will definitely serve you well. The second technique is called levelling. It's a bit more involved, but it can produce better results. As opposed to just building your base plate above everything, you instead want to kind of follow the general flow of the land. Your build should hug the ground reasonably well and follow the elevation differences. Now, you don't want to follow too strictly, but generally try to make sure your ceilings are always above the grass layer, and I'd say only make adjustments in one or even half tile increments. This method works particularly well if you build everything around a central structure. This is called layering and adds a bit more structure to the build, which will help later on when we do build everything up. If you do this, you'll probably end up with a base plate that looks something akin to this. It's pretty amorphous at the moment, but in my head I've planned out a central area, surrounded by rooms and corridors that rise and fall in elevation. I've closed all the gaps and added the stairs, and I also even chose to raise a small section up at the back and a section close to the ground on the left. I think I might be making this seem easier than it actually is. Being able to just build on the flow of the land like this is a skill you'll pick up, but it's worth practicing this in single player at least a little bit. This is the room layout I'm going for here, which should help you better visualise what I'm seeing in my head. The name of the game here is elevation differences, which should help to make the build look good once it's all done. From here we can then construct the build with whatever material we want. The idea behind this is that the differences in elevation will naturally carry through to the walls and the roof, which will help to create an interesting looking build that plays well with the ground, whilst not having to rely too heavily on building facades to cover ugly stretches of wall connecting to the ground. With elevation differences like this, it will naturally result in a quite staircase heavy design, as there will likely be a good amount of elevation changes, but that can work very nicely for some styles. When we finish off, the build ends up tackling this pretty difficult terrain fairly well. You'll notice I also included some facade elements to give the build visual support. That's something you kind of have to consider on a case by case basis to avoid any flat or boring areas. In this case, the finished build actually still had a few of those areas, so covering them with footers helped to blend this design with the terrain much better. Now, if I'm being honest, this build still isn't perfect. This technique is much more effective than the elevation method when it's done properly, but I do think it is a lot harder to execute. The elevation method relies simply upon masking ugly areas, whereas this technique also needs a good balance, which I think is often much harder to achieve. I've done much better builds with this style, namely Shimko Castle comes to mind. That was probably one of my best builds using the levelling method. The third and final method is very simple, though a bit niche, as it works best for towers. That is the connection method, where you build smaller designs and connect them together. Honestly, there's very little to say here, as the method kind of explains itself. It's a good way to build across extremely uneven terrain, and sometimes you can mix this idea in with other methods, but I'm not a huge fan of it as a primary method myself. I've used it once or twice. The most recent was a Necromancer's Tower build at the start of the Age of Sorcery, but I generally just prefer elevation or levelling, as I find connection is just a pretty niche method that only really works well for a couple of different styles. And there we have it, my 3 methods for building on uneven ground. It's definitely a struggle to try and build on terrain like this, and I've had many questions about it over the years I've been making content, so hopefully this video answers those questions and provides some valuable solutions. Thanks for watching, and of course a massive thanks to our wonderful esteemed coffee cultists for continuing to support the channel over on Patreon. If you have any more tips, questions, or other topics you'd like me to explain, feel free to leave them down in the comments. Again, thank you very much for watching, take care, and I'll see you soon.